The night was calm, illuminated by the soft glow of streetlights stretching along the wide, well-kept sidewalks of the affluent neighborhood. John Mitchell was on his usual patrol, walking with firm steps and the upright posture of someone who believed he was in total control. He was young and new to the police force, with an insatiable desire to prove his worth and live up to the badge he wore. In this area, problems rarely arose, but John remained alert, looking for anything out of the ordinary. Just a few minutes later, he stopped walking. His gaze landed on a car parked across the street, a sleek, black vehicle that looked brand new. Under the streetlight, the car had an impeccable shine, almost conspicuous, standing out against everything around it. Beside the car, a black man, elegant, dressed in a dark suit, was adjusting his shirt cuffs and checking his watch, as if waiting for someone. John felt a chill, a sense of alert. For a moment, he tried to dismiss the thought, but it persisted. Something about the man seemed out of place. He couldn't pinpoint exactly what, but it was as if his instincts were telling him the man didn't belong there. John knew the neighborhood had its traditional residents, and any intruder would quickly attract attention. And to him, this man was completely unexpected. Taking a deep breath and adjusting his stance, John decided he would make an approach. After all, he was the kind of officer who took pride in his attention to detail. He started crossing the street, keeping his eyes fixed on the man. As he got closer, he noted every detail. The man's posture, his calm expression, the confidence that seemed to radiate from him. When he was just a few steps away, the man lifted his head, noticing his presence. John observed that he had a calm expression, as if he was accustomed to being watched. Something in that attitude heightened John's sense of discomfort, but he continued forward.
Good evening, sir. I need to ask you a few questions. Is that all right?
John tried to sound casual, but his tone came out stiffer than he had planned, laced with a cautious professionalism that didn't seem necessary, but which he couldn't avoid. The man looked at him with a slight smile, a smile that seemed to hold a certain silent understanding. The man's calm response made John hesitate for a moment. There was something about the way he spoke, a tone of confidence, maybe even lightness, that left the officer somewhat unsettled. But John forced himself to continue, determined to follow procedure. The man tilted his head slightly, as if reflecting on the question. His expression was that of someone perhaps accustomed to similar situations. He then responded, remaining calm. John pressed his lips together, feeling a slight frustration. He had hoped for an answer that would give him a legitimate reason to continue questioning. But the man's response, direct and objective, seemed to suggest he had nothing to hide. The man nodded without hesitation, as if it were something he was already used to. With a calm movement, he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pulled out his wallet, and extended it to the officer with the same serenity as before. John took the wallet quickly, with a sense of urgency that he didn't fully understand. His eyes scanned the information on the ID, absorbing the name, David Langston, without any apparent reason. The name didn't seem to mean anything to him, but a sense of unease settled in his chest, as if something were hidden between the lines. He handed the ID back, having found nothing to justify his discomfort. Yet at the same time, a stubborn feeling that something was off wouldn't leave him. "And what exactly is your appointment here?" John insisted, trying to keep his tone neutral, though a hint of suspicion was evident. David gave a polite smile, but his gaze grew a bit more serious. He seemed to consider whether he should answer, or if it was truly necessary. The response, once again polite and direct, left John with a feeling of frustration. He wanted, perhaps needed, some concrete proof that the man was doing something wrong. But everything in David's behavior only showed calm and dignity. The tension between the two seemed to grow with each answer. John took a deep breath, feeling his nerves on edge, and he didn't know exactly why. He looked away for a moment, and noticed that a few people were starting to observe the interaction from a distance, likely drawn by the sight of the officer there. Uncomfortable with the presence of witnesses, John decided to act more firmly. He then took a step forward and gestured for David to step away from the car. David blinked slowly, watching the officer with a look that mixed curiosity and patience. David's response, firm but controlled, triggered something in John, as if he interpreted the man's stance as a sign of defiance. Feeling pressured, he made a decision that, deep down, he knew might not be fair. David hesitated for the first time, and the smile disappeared from his face. He stared at John for a few seconds, trying to understand exactly what was happening. But, realizing that the order was firm, he finally raised his hands and placed them on the vehicle, allowing John to proceed with the search. While the officer conducted the search, a small group of people drew even closer, some taking out their phones to record the moment. Murmurs and indignant looks began to arise. A sense of injustice hung in the air, and even a few expressions of disapproval could be noticed. John, however, remained focused, almost ignoring the presence of the onlookers. When he finished the search, it was clear that he hadn't found anything suspicious. Even so, suspicion still dominated him. He stepped away from David and stared at him intensely, as if expecting a reaction. David sighed, remaining calm, though he couldn't hide the evident discomfort in his gaze.
Are you satisfied, officer?
The question, filled with dignity, echoed through the silent street. John felt a wave of doubt and discomfort, but he didn't back down. Something within him still insisted that this man was hiding something. John remained silent for a few seconds, trying to process David's question. Satisfied? The word echoed in his mind, yet he felt challenged. Deep down, he knew he had no legitimate reason to continue this, but something compelled him to press on. Maybe it was the discomfort of being confronted by someone so self-assured, or perhaps it was something deeper he didn't yet understand. Around them, the group of people watched in silence, phones raised to record every detail. He knew this could become an issue if the situation escalated, but his desire to assert his control was stronger. David looked at him, impassive, with his hands still on the car. His breathing was steady, and his expression conveyed a mix of indignation and patience. Without averting his gaze, he finally decided to break the silence.
Listen, officer. I don't know what your problem with me is, but I've been cooperative enough. I'm here for a meeting, as I've already explained. And frankly, I expected a more respectful treatment.
David's words were firm, without being aggressive. But to John, they felt like a blow. He felt his face flush, and a wave of anger rose within him. Who did this man think he was, talking to an officer that way?
Respectful? I'm just doing my job, sir. It's nothing personal.
John tried to keep his tone professional, but anger slipped through his words. He stepped even closer to David, standing just a few inches away, as if trying to intimidate him.
Maybe you don't think it's personal, officer. But from my perspective, this feels nothing short of harassment.
A wave of murmurs came from the crowd of onlookers upon hearing David's response. People began to whisper in low voices, and John felt uncomfortable with his lack of control over the situation. Noticing he was being observed and filmed from all angles, he had an idea to assert his authority. He hardened his expression, keeping his gaze fixed on David.
Sir, I'm going to need you to accompany me to the station for clarification. If you have nothing to hide, it shouldn't be a problem.
David let out a dry laugh, but his gaze remained sharp. He seemed unable to believe what he had just heard.
The station? Clarification? Listen, officer, this has gone too far. Are you aware of what you're doing?
David's voice, though restrained, now carried a warning tone. But instead of disarming him, this only made John feel an even greater need to maintain control over the situation.
If everything's in order, sir, this shouldn't be a problem. Or would you prefer to resist?
John knew he was pushing the situation, but the very thought of losing this interaction in front of so many witnesses was unbearable. He had already crossed a line, and now he felt he couldn't back down. David took a deep breath, his expression shifting to one of disappointment and exhaustion. He knew that refusing would be seen as resistance, and that the situation could worsen, especially with cameras pointed at him.
Fine. I'll accompany you to the station. But let me be clear, this will not go unanswered.
The murmurs in the crowd intensified. Some onlookers began to speak out loudly, questioning the need for such an approach. A woman stepped forward and shouted at John, indignant.
"This is ridiculous. He didn't do anything."
John ignored the comment, maintaining his firm role. He gestured for David to follow, holding a rigid, authoritative posture. He knew people were outraged, but he was determined not to show any sign of weakness. As they walked toward the patrol car, David looked at the group, watching him with expressions of solidarity and compassion, even in silence. It was evident that their support gave him a bit of strength amidst the absurdity of the situation. When they reached the patrol car, John opened the back door and gestured for David to get in.
Get in, Mr. Langston.
David hesitated for a moment, but entered the car with the same dignity he had maintained throughout the encounter. On the way to the station, the silence between them was heavy, filled with tension and resentment. John stared fixedly at the road, trying to ignore David's presence in the back seat. In his mind, an internal conflict was unfolding. Part of him knew he had crossed a line, but another part refused to admit any wrongdoing. David, meanwhile, looked out the window, reflecting on the injustice he had just endured. He had been through similar situations before, but this one felt worse. Perhaps because of the silent brutality of the humiliation, compounded by the witnesses who had seen him treated in this way. When they arrived at the station, John parked the car and got out, going around to open the door for David. As soon as David stepped out of the car, he adjusted his jacket and stood tall, even under the curious gaze of passing officers and civilians. He wouldn't let himself be treated like an ordinary suspect. John, however, left no room for conversation and promptly led him into the station. As they entered, some officers and staff looked at David with surprise and curiosity, but didn't dare to ask questions. Seeing the scene, the police chief, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, came out of his office and approached John with a raised eyebrow, clearly intrigued by the situation.
"Mitchell, what's going on here?"
John held his gaze steady and responded quickly, trying to maintain his composure.
I found this man behaving suspiciously in a residential neighborhood. I brought him in to clarify a few things.
The police chief looked from David to John, and his expression shifted from mild to serious in an instant. He seemed to understand that something deeper was going on here.
"I see. And you, sir? Can you tell me your name?"
David raised his head, responding calmly with a restrained dignity that made the police chief furrow his brow.
My name is David Langston. I was on my way to a business meeting when I was approached and brought here against my will, without justified cause.
The police chief's expression changed dramatically. His eyes widened for a moment before he managed to regain his composure.
"Langston. David Langston."
The chief turned to John, his face now filled with indignation, and lowered his voice to avoid an even bigger scene.
"Mitchell, do you have any idea who he is?"
John frowned, beginning to realize that he had made a serious mistake.
Sir, I didn't know.
The chief sighed, trying to keep his composure.
"I suggest you apologize to Mr. Langston right now."
John felt his face flush with the chief's disapproval. He knew he hadn't considered the potential repercussions of his decision, but now he was caught in his own mistake. With a sudden feeling of nervousness, he approached David, the tension evident in his rigid posture.
Mr. Langston,
He hesitated, the words sticking in his throat. He didn't know how to apologize without sounding weak. David watched him in silence, maintaining a firm and impenetrable expression. There was a dignity in his gaze that left John unsettled. The police chief, noticing John's awkwardness, decided to intervene.
Mr. Langston, on behalf of the department, I would like to apologize for this situation. I'm sure we can resolve this immediately.
The police chief's tone was respectful, but David sensed a discomfort in his voice. He looked around, noticing the curious and judgmental glances from the other officers. A feeling of humiliation, mixed with a forced calm, washed over him.
Resolve? With all due respect, Chief, this situation goes beyond a simple mistake. I was treated like a criminal, forcibly brought here and exposed in front of everyone.
The chief took a deep breath, aware of the gravity in David's words. He knew he needed to find a way to de-escalate the situation before things got out of control.
I understand perfectly, Mr. Langston. If you need anything, I'm at your disposal. And, of course, this approach will be investigated appropriately.
David nodded slightly, but his eyes didn't soften. The experience was still etched into his expression, like a shadow that refused to fade.
Investigated? Chief, this isn't just about a formal investigation. It's a matter of how authority was used abusively, without any justification.
The police chief felt pressured. He moved closer to John, speaking in a lower tone.
Mitchell, I want you in my office now. And let's be clear. We will be having a discussion about your behavior later.
John nodded quickly, averting his gaze from David, unable to face the man after what he had done. He followed the chief in silence, while David remained in the station lobby, surrounded by looks ranging from curiosity to embarrassment. David observed the scene around him and realized that his presence was causing palpable discomfort. Some officers looked away, while others whispered among themselves. It was as if, instead of an individual, he represented an invisible threat that hovered in the air. He adjusted his posture and prepared to leave the station, but as he turned, he was met by a group of journalists who had quickly arrived after hearing about his detention. Microphones and cameras were raised immediately, focused on his face, eager for any statement.
Mr. Langston, how do you feel after this approach?
David took a deep breath, looking directly at the cameras. The anger and disappointment were clear on his face, but he maintained his composure. He knew this was the right moment to take a stand, but not impulsively.
How do I feel? I feel that this is a reflection of something much bigger than just a mistaken approach. It's a problem that goes beyond me and highlights the urgent need for change.
David's response was direct but controlled. He knew that impulsive words could escalate the situation. The reporters crowded even closer, eager for more details.
Do you plan to take action against the police department?
It's not about revenge or retaliation. I'm here to draw attention to a larger issue that affects many others besides me. This situation shouldn't happen to anyone.
As David responded, he could feel the weight of the cameras and microphones around him, but he stayed focused on his message. He knew he was in a moment of exposure, but he could use it for something positive. Inside the police chief's office, John watched the interview unfold from the window. He felt a knot in his stomach as he realized the scale the situation was taking on. The chief observed him in silence, his expression serious.
Mitchell, do you understand the gravity of what you've done?
Yes, sir. I don't know what got into me.
The chief crossed his arms, keeping his eyes fixed on John. He seemed to be evaluating the officer, trying to understand if he fully grasped the repercussions of his actions.
It's not just a matter of an isolated mistake. You put the department in a delicate situation, and more importantly, you wronged an innocent man. I hope you understand the seriousness of this.
John looked away, unable to hide his shame. He knew there were no plausible excuses for what he had done, yet the chief's words weighed like a final verdict.
I understand, sir. I just felt that something was wrong.
And based on that feeling, you decided to detain a man in a humiliating and unjust manner? Do you really think that's justifiable?
The chief's voice was laced with frustration. He knew John was a promising young officer, but this mistake was a clear sign that something was amiss in his approach. Outside, David was finishing his brief interview with the journalists. He bid them farewell, thanking the people around him for their support. With steady steps, he left the station, but the situation was far from resolved. As he walked out, he saw some of the onlookers who had recorded his detention. They approached him, offering words of support and solidarity, showing that they were on his side. David thanked them all, but deep down, the feeling of humiliation remained, like an invisible mark. He knew that this incident wouldn't be forgotten any time soon, but instead of bitterness, he felt something different. As the people around him dispersed, David walked toward his car. His steps were calm, but his gaze was distant, already reflecting on the steps he would take to turn this experience into real change. In the chief's office, John formally said his farewells, feeling humiliated but trying to hide his shame. As he left, he knew that his image within the department had been tarnished, and that his own view of his profession now seemed uncertain. David left the station, but the cameras and microphones seemed to follow him. News of his detention and the way he was treated was already circulating in the media and on social networks. The incident was spreading quickly, generating a wave of outrage. Gradually, influential people and organizations began to speak out about the case. Inside the station, John watched the commotion through the window, feeling increasingly uneasy. He was still trying to grasp the magnitude of what he had done. He had acted impulsively, without any concrete reason, and now it seemed his mistake was about to ruin his career. Soon he noticed that some of his colleagues were looking at him strangely, as if they knew something he hadn't fully grasped yet. With each passing second, his discomfort grew, and he wasn't entirely sure why. Then, a sergeant approached him, holding a tablet and wearing a serious expression.
"Mitchell, have you seen this?"
He asked bluntly, showing him the screen. John frowned and took the tablet from the sergeant's hands, unsure of what to expect. On the screen, he saw a headline that made his stomach churn. There was a picture of David Langston with a striking title, "Businessman and Philanthropist Humiliated by Police. Discrimination or Abuse of Power?" He skimmed through the article quickly, feeling his face flush with each word. It described David as an influential businessman, responsible for various social initiatives and with an untarnished reputation in the city. The article recounted the incident, the wrongful detainment, and Langston's discomfort at being treated like a criminal. John felt the impact of this information like a blow. David Langston wasn't just someone out of place. He was one of the most respected men in the region, known for his community work and business success. This wasn't just a wrongful detainment. It was a scandal. As he absorbed the information, the police chief appeared, now with an expression even more laden with disapproval.
"Mitchell, come to my office. We need to talk urgently."
The chief's voice was cold, and John knew there was no escape. He followed his superior to the office in silence, his mind racing. Once they were both seated, the chief closed the door, keeping his eyes fixed on him.
"Do you have any idea of the damage you've just caused, Mitchell? You brought one of the city's most influential men here in handcuffs, without any reason. And all of this because of an absurd assumption."
John felt small under the chief's reproachful gaze. He tried to find words to justify his actions, but anything he could say felt hollow.
Sir, I thought he was acting suspiciously. I didn't know he was...
"You didn't know?"
The chief interrupted, his tone indignant.
"So you think that justifies what you did? That the mistake lies in his identity, not in your behavior?"
The chief's remark at John like a slap in the face. He had always considered himself fair and diligent, but now he was confronted with a reality he preferred to ignore. It was easier to think he had made a mistake than to admit he had acted based on unconscious biases. The chief took a deep breath and ran a hand over his face, as if trying to contain his frustration. He knew that a racial discrimination scandal could ruin the department's reputation and compromise his leadership.
"I want you to understand, Mitchell. that the department is in an extremely delicate situation. The media is all over this, and we cannot allow our work to be tarnished by actions like this."
John nodded, feeling crushed by the weight of the chief's words. He knew his actions had no justification, and the guilt was becoming increasingly unbearable.
I understand, sir. I accept any consequences.
The chief stared at him for a few seconds, as if assessing the sincerity of his response.
"There will definitely be consequences. But right now, the priority is to address what's already in motion. That includes a public apology."
John felt a chill run down his spine. A public apology was humiliating, but he knew it was the least he could do after what he had done. He nodded slowly, accepting the inevitable.
"We'll be calling a press conference to handle this case shortly. Until then, you're suspended, Mitchell. Go home and wait for further instructions."
John left the office, stunned. Each step he took felt heavier, and he could feel the gazes of his colleagues following him with a mix of reproach and pity. When he finally exited the station, John looked up at the sky in an attempt to clear his mind. But the cloud seemed as heavy as his own thoughts, and he realized that his career, reputation, and even his self-perception were in ruins. As John processed all of this, on the other side of town, David Langston was also reflecting on the situation. However, his focus was not just on the humiliation he had endured. In his office, he reviewed documents and took notes in a notebook, visualizing the steps to turn this episode into a starting point for a new campaign against discrimination and abuse of authority. He didn't just want justice for himself, but for everyone who had experienced something similar. He knew that with his influence, he could turn this episode into a larger cause and, in doing so, give voice to others who had faced silent injustices. One of his assistants entered the room and interrupted him.
"Mr. Langston, the press has been in constant contact, asking for more information about the incident. Several journalists are requesting an official statement."
David pondered for a moment. He knew that a statement could draw more attention to the case, but he didn't want it to become just another sensationalist headline.
Tell them I'll be holding a press conference soon. We need to ensure the focus is on what truly matters.
The assistant nodded, leaving the room to relay the information to the communications team. David remained in his office, looking out the window. He took a deep breath, gathering strength for the next step. Meanwhile, on social media, the case was gaining momentum. Videos and accounts of the incident were multiplying, generating thousands of shares and comments. Most messages were supportive of David, while others discussed the need for structural changes in how the police approach suspects. The situation was taking on a dimension that neither David nor John could have anticipated, and the unfolding events seemed increasingly inevitable. The days following the incident were busy for David. The news of his baseless detainment had already been reproduced by dozens of outlets, and the pressure for an official stance was undeniable. So, he decided it was time to speak and called a press conference. The conference room where the event was held was packed with journalists, cameras, microphones, and flashes. Representatives from local and national media waited eagerly. There was a feeling of anticipation, a mix of indignation and curiosity. David entered the room with the same dignified posture he had maintained throughout the episode. He wore a dark suit, and his expression was calm but resolute. He walked up to the podium prepared for him, and the murmurs in the room immediately fell silent. After adjusting the microphone, he looked out at the audience and began to speak, his voice clear and controlled.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you for being here. I'm not here to talk about myself, but about something that affects countless people every day, something we experience in silence and that, unfortunately, I had to face in a very personal way.
David's opening words captured everyone's attention in the room. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, and he continued, his voice conveying a calmness that contrasted with the weight of his statements.
On Tuesday night, I was approached by the police in a neighborhood where I was working, on my way to an important meeting. Without justification, I was treated as a suspect, searched, and then taken in handcuffs to the station.
And why?
Because my presence there seemed out of place.
David paused, letting the silence lend weight to his words. Everyone in the room could feel the intensity of the moment, and he used the emotional impact to continue.
This isn't just about me, as I've said. This is about something much bigger. It's about everyone who is judged and punished before even committing any crime, about all those who bear the weight of a suspicious gaze simply for who they are.
The cameras recorded every word, and the journalist took notes attentively. David looked at the audience, his eyes moving from side to side across the room, as if to ensure that everyone there truly understood the gravity of the issue.
And that's why I've decided to turn this experience into an opportunity for real change. I don't seek revenge nor personal restitution. My goal is to prevent this from continuing to happen, so others don't have to go through what I did.
A murmur of agreement rippled through those present. David paused again, controlling the tone and intensity of his words, allowing the message to settle. He knew that for many there, his words were more than a personal account. They were an indictment.
I'm announcing here that soon I will launch a foundation dedicated to combating discrimination and social injustice. This foundation will not only play a role in advocacy, it will be a channel for support and transformation. It will be a space to educate and equip those with the power to change the system.
Camera flashes erupted as David announced his new project. Journalists jostled for a better view, and some even raised their hands for questions, but he wasn't finished yet.
This isn't just about correcting a specific mistake. It's about correcting an entire structure that allows this discrimination to be repeated. I know this isn't an easy task, but I have hope that together we can make a difference.
He gave a brief nod to his team, signaling that he would take questions. Instantly, several hands shot up. He chose a reporter who looked eager.
Mr. Langston, do you believe this initiative will really have an impact on how law enforcement treats citizens?
I believe that every step toward change matters. I don't expect a miraculous and immediate transformation, but I believe that through education, dialogue, and proper policies, we can create a new culture. This is the first step of many to come.
David responded firmly, his tone filled with conviction. He then looked around, choosing one more person for the next question.
Mr. Langston, do you believe that the officer involved should face legal consequences?
David took a deep breath before answering. It was a delicate question, and he knew his response would be closely scrutinized.
I do believe there should be consequences, yes. However, my focus is on structural change so actions like this don't happen again. I prefer to concentrate my energy on building a new reality, rather than simply punishing isolated individuals.
His words once again made an impact. The journalists exchanged glances, impressed by David's composure. He wasn't swayed by impulse, and his calm conveyed a rare maturity and confidence. The press conference continued for a few more minutes, with David answering questions and sharing more details about his foundation. He spoke about the need for security personnel training, legal support for victims of discrimination, and plans to offer educational programs for youth awareness. When he finally concluded the conference, he thanked the journalists and gave a discreet nod before leaving the room. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of respect and admiration. He hadn't presented himself just as a victim. He had shown himself as a leader. Outside, a few reporters still tried to follow him for more statements, but David merely smiled and waved politely. He knew the message had been delivered, and now it was time to focus on the concrete work to implement his ideas. As he walked away from the venue, he felt a new energy pulsing within him. He was no longer merely reacting to what had happened. Now he was acting, using the experience as a transformative force. Meanwhile, at home, John watched the press conference on television. Sitting on the couch, he observed each of David's words with a mix of shame and discomfort. Seeing the man he had detained without reason, now so respected and admired, only reinforced the gravity of his mistake. John knew that an apology would be inevitable and that his career might never be the same. But at that moment, something deeper bothered him. He felt he needed to understand better the root of what had led him to act that way, and this wasn't something a simple apology could resolve. When the broadcast ended, John turned off the TV and sat in silence, his thoughts still racing. He knew he needed to do more than just wait for the consequences. He needed to understand what was wrong within himself to prevent something like this from happening again. In the hours and days following the press conference, the story took on unimaginable proportions. National news and talk shows covered the case. David Langston was invited to speak on various platforms, and his story quickly became one of the most discussed topics on social media. Hashtags related to the case began trending. Thousands of people were commenting, sharing their own stories of discrimination, and supporting the new foundation David had promised to create. He spent long hours on the phone, receiving messages from influential figures, organizations, and even politicians interested in supporting his cause. Each call, each message, reinforced his determination. John, on the other hand, watched everything with a feeling of helplessness. He found himself caught in a storm of his own making. Since his suspension, he had spent his time isolated, avoiding calls and going out. People's gazes on the street seemed to judge him, even though no one said anything. When he finally decided to check social media, he saw his name in countless comments, all related to the incident. Some labeled him as a symbol of a deeply rooted societal issue. Others openly accused him of racism and abuse of power. With each post, he felt a mixture of shame and regret. One day, while scrolling through comments in silence, he found a direct message from an old Academy colleague, Lucas. Without any preamble, Lucas got straight to the point.
Man, I heard about what happened. Is it all true? This doesn't sound like the John the First knew.
John hesitated before responding. He knew Lucas's words carried weight. He didn't recognize himself in that role either. Finally, he typed a short reply.
I messed up, Lucas. I'm not going to justify what I did. I just wish I could understand why better.
There was a brief pause before Lucas replied.
If you want to understand, then do something about it. Reach out to David. Talk to him. Maybe that'll help you.
John stared at the message for a long time, feeling vulnerable and exposed. Reaching out to David was a daunting idea. He knew the conversation wouldn't be easy, and he might face some hard truths about himself. But at the same time, he felt Lucas was right. It was as if he was stuck in darkness that only David could help shed light on. While John considered the suggestion, David continued moving forward with his plans for the foundation. He had gathered a team of lawyers, educators, and activists, all committed to the mission of fighting discrimination and injustice. In one of the planning meetings, his assistant presented an analysis of the public reactions to the case.
Mr. Langston, social media is flooded with support for your foundation. Many people are sharing stories similar to yours. I think this shows how much your initiative is already sparking reflection.
David nodded, absorbing the information. He knew the support was essential, but he also understood that the real challenge was only just beginning.
Support is welcome, but I want our foundation to focus on concrete actions. We're here to make a real impact, not just on social media.
The assistant agreed, taking notes on the next steps for the project. David was determined to turn the episode into a force for change, and each meeting strengthened his goal of creating a fairer society. While David advanced with his projects, John still hesitated, but he knew he had to take the first step. After days of struggling with pride and fear, he decided to act. He picked up the phone and searched for David Langston's contact. With trembling hands and a heavy breath, he finally dialed the number, unsure if David would answer. The phone rang a few times before David's voice came through on the other end, calm and surprisingly cordial.
Hello, David Langston speaking.
John felt his throat tighten and needed a moment before responding.
Mr. Langston, this is John Mitchell. I know this call may be unwelcome, but I need to speak with you if you'll allow me.
There was silence on the other end, and John feared that David would simply hang up. But instead, he heard David's calm reply.
Yes, Officer Mitchell. What is it you want?
David's controlled and cool tone made him even more nervous. John took a deep breath before continuing.
I would like to apologize in person, but I also want to understand better. I want to hear what you have to say about all this. I need to learn from my mistake.
David was silent for a few seconds, considering. When he finally replied, his voice wasn't filled with resentment, but was firm.
Mitchell, I can't guarantee this conversation will be easy for either of us. But if you're willing to listen and reflect, then we can arrange a meeting. Perhaps it's indeed time for us to have this conversation.
John felt a wave of relief mixed with nervousness. He knew it wouldn't be a simple meeting, but David's willingness to receive him was more than he had expected.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate the opportunity.
David ended the call with a straightforward, no-nonsense response.
I'll expect your visit tomorrow at 10 in my office. I hope you're truly willing to listen.
The call ended, and John remained still, reflecting on what he was about to do. He saw the meeting as a step towards a deeper understanding of what it meant to be an agent of change, but also as an opportunity to try to repair, at least in part, the damage he had caused. The next day, he woke up early, mentally preparing for the meeting with David. He felt anxious but determined. He dressed simply and arrived at David's office at the appointed time, waiting in the reception area while trying to contain his anxiety. When David came to greet him, the atmosphere was tense. John stood up, nervous, and extended a timid handshake, which David accepted with a cordial but cold nod. They walked to the meeting room in silence. Once inside, David gestured to a chair for John and sat across from him. The silence between them felt heavy, each waiting for the right moment to start speaking. David finally broke the silence, his tone direct.
Before anything else, I want to know what really brought you here, officer. I don't want an empty apology. I want to understand why you think this conversation is necessary.
John swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the question. He took a deep breath before responding, with a sincerity he hadn't known he possessed.
Because I need to understand where I went wrong, Mr. Langston. I need to understand what led me to act that way, what made me misinterpret the situation so badly.
David watched him closely, assessing every word.
Then that's a good start, Mitchell. And I hope you're prepared to hear some uncomfortable truths.
John nodded silently, knowing this was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey of self-discovery. In the meeting room, the silence was almost suffocating. John felt the weight of David's gaze, who was studying him with attention and seriousness. He knew he was there to confront a truth he had avoided for a long time, but he wasn't sure how to start. Each word seemed to fail before it even formed in his mind.
Mitchell, before any apologies or justifications, I want to understand what made you act that way that night. Because to me, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a decision, a choice. So I want to hear from you, what really went through your mind.
David's direct question cut like a knife. John felt his stomach tighten and looked away, ashamed. He knew what David was implying, and though reluctant, he needed to face it. He took a deep breath, trying to organize his words, though the feeling of discomfort grew with each second.
That night, when I saw you in that neighborhood, I thought you...
He paused, struggling to find a way to explain, but knew any response would sound hollow. David remained silent, watching John with a serious expression, waiting for a more honest answer.
The truth is, I thought you were out of place, and I realize now how terrible that sounds. But that's what I thought. I figured that being in that neighborhood, driving a luxury car, there was something strange.
David leaned forward slightly, his gaze penetrating.
Strange? Or impossible? You looked at me and assumed I couldn't legitimately be there. That simply by being who I am, I didn't belong. Tell me, Mitchell, why do you think you reacted that way?
John felt a tightness in his chest. The truth was there, raw and unfiltered, and he knew he could no longer hide from it. With effort, he looked at David, trying to keep his voice steady.
Because you're black. And to me, at that moment, that seemed like a sign that something was wrong.
Shame consumed him as he spoke, but he knew he had to be honest. The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. David remained still, but his gaze grew sharper, as if analyzing every word John had said.
You know, Mitchell, I can't say I'm surprised by your answer. But I want you to understand something very important. That kind of thinking, that reaction you had, is exactly what makes people like me suspect wherever we go. It's that subtle prejudice that creates the cycle of discrimination and humiliation.
John felt the weight of David's words and realized this went beyond what he had imagined. He tried to absorb what the businessman was saying, but the shame and discomfort made it difficult.
The problem, Mitchell, is that you probably don't realize how many times you've had this kind of reaction without even noticing. This may be the first time you've been confronted with it, but I, like many others, deal with it every day.
John nodded, unable to find words to respond. He was faced with a reality he had always ignored, but could no longer pretend not to see.
I never thought about it that way. I never thought that what I did could have that impact, or that I was contributing to something like this. I always thought I was just doing my job.
Well, now you understand that doing your job doesn't exempt you from responsibility for the decisions you make and the assumptions you act on. Decisions based on prejudice, even if you don't recognize them as such, are dangerous, and people like me pay the price.
David paused, letting each word sink into John's defenses. He knew this was a crucial moment, where the officer could truly grasp the weight of his actions.
You want to understand where you went wrong? Then start by recognizing that your mistake was rooted in prejudice. Acknowledge that, for some reason, you thought it was acceptable to doubt my integrity simply because I'm black in an upscale neighborhood. Until you can face that truth, anything you say or do will be empty.
John looked down, his hands sweaty and trembling. David's words hit him hard, and he knew each one was true. He tried to process the vulnerability and guilt he was feeling, finally realizing he was facing a truth he could no longer deny.
I accept that. I know I can't go back and undo what I did, but I want to learn to be a better person. Not just for myself, but for everyone who might experience something like this because of me.
David kept his gaze steady on John, observing what seemed like a genuine sincerity emerging for the first time. He realized that, though the officer had a long road ahead, this was a beginning.
Then start with the first step, Mitchell. Be willing to question your assumptions and face the discomfort of seeing the truth. And understand that this isn't just a lesson. It's a responsibility you have, especially as someone in a position of authority.
John nodded, feeling the gravity of those words. He knew he was at the threshold of change. But this change would depend on his willingness to confront the darker side of himself. David sighed, and his tone softened slightly.
What I expect, Mitchell, isn't an apology. What I expect is for you to truly change, to understand that your actions have consequences, that your view of the world needs adjustment. Because if that doesn't happen, nothing I do will have real value.
John took a deep breath, understanding the depth of David's words. He felt that this meeting had shifted something within him, and now it was up to him to choose how to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Langston, for not only listening to me, but for showing me the impact of my actions. I know this doesn't change what I did, but I can assure you that I'll work hard to change from here on.
David gave a slight nod, and a contemplative silence filled the room. John knew that this moment didn't erase what he had done, but it represented a starting point. He left with the feeling that a new path lay ahead, a path he would need to tread carefully and with self-reflection. As John left David's office, he felt a mix of shame and hope. The process of transformation would be long and challenging, but for the first time, he was willing to face whatever it took to become worthy of the position he held. David watched him leave in silence, aware that this was only an initial step. He knew the true test would come with time, when John returned to his work and was challenged once again. But at that moment, he felt he had done what he could to plant the seed of change. Back in his office, David sat down and let the day's exhaustion wash over him. He knew the fight for justice was a long one and wouldn't be won with a single conversation or initiative. But for now, he allowed himself a brief moment of relief. The first step had been taken. The following days were intense for John. After his meeting with David, he returned home with his mind racing, feeling stripped of all illusions he'd had about himself. David's words still echoed in his mind, and he knew he could no longer ignore the truths he'd heard. When the police department announced the press conference, He received the news with a mix of relief and anxiety. He knew he needed to apologize publicly, not just because it was required by the department, but because he was beginning to understand the responsibility of his actions. On the appointed day, the conference hall was packed with reporters, cameras, and even citizens interested in seeing the outcome of the case. There was an air of expectation, and John felt the critical gazes on him as he stood beside the chief of police. He tried to remain calm, but the nervousness was evident in his trembling hands. When it was his turn to speak, he took a deep breath and faced the public. He needed the courage not to rely on empty excuses and to accept his fault genuinely.
Good afternoon. I'm here to acknowledge the mistake I made and to offer a public apology to Mr. David Langston and to everyone affected by my actions. On that night, I made an impulsive and prejudiced decision, and I now realize that I acted without any basis. My biases blinded me, and this failure caused pain and humiliation to an innocent man. I know that an apology cannot undo what I've done, but I am committed to change and to learn from this mistake.
The silence in the room was profound. The audience seemed to be weighing the sincerity of every word that came out of his mouth. He continued, feeling the weight of responsibility.
I promise to dedicate myself to understanding more deeply how my prejudices influence my work and my life. I don't expect immediate forgiveness, but I want everyone to know that I will not take this commitment to change lightly.
He concluded the speech with a slight bow of his head, a gesture of respect and remorse. Outside the room, the public reaction was mixed. Some people seemed willing to believe in his sincerity, while others remained skeptical. Later, as John left the venue, he was approached by reporters still seeking further statements. He listened to them in silence, but didn't respond. He knew that anything said at that moment could sound hollow. All he had to do now was prove his change through his actions. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, David was preparing for the launch of his foundation. He had spent the past few days in intense meetings, securing partnerships and outlining the action plan. News of John's press conference reached him through videos and headlines, but he preferred to keep his focus on the work at hand. The night before the launch event, David gathered his team for a final meeting. He looked at each face around the table, recognizing the enthusiasm and determination in everyone.
Tomorrow we start a new chapter, all of us. This foundation isn't just a project for me, it's a commitment for everyone who believes in justice and equality. I want you to know that I fully trust each of you to ensure our mission has a real impact.
The team members nodded, and the room was filled with energy. David knew this was the first step of a long journey, but he felt grateful to have a dedicated team willing to fight alongside him. The next day, the launch took place in a packed auditorium. People from various walks of life attended the event, including activists, political figures, and representatives from other NGOs. David was warmly applauded as he stepped onto the stage, and his inspiring speech further strengthened the foundation's purpose.
Today we begin a journey towards a more just and aware society. This foundation was created to be a platform for transformation so that no one has to go through what I did. Together we will build a future where everyone can walk down any street in any neighborhood, without fear of being judged or humiliated.
David's words were met with enthusiasm, and he felt that the event had been a success. The foundation's concrete work would soon begin, with educational campaigns, legal support for victims of discrimination, and training programs for security professionals. As the event unfolded, John watched everything from afar. David's words echoed in his mind, and he felt a mix of shame and respect. He knew that real change would require more than his apology. It would demand a continuous commitment to undo the biases he carried. At the end of the event, David received messages of support from various influential figures and people with stories similar to his own. To him, it was a sign that he was on the right path. On impulse, John decided to send a short message to David. He knew he didn't deserve a response, but he felt the need to express his gratitude.
Mr. Langston, I watched the Foundation's inauguration, and I just want to thank you for your commitment to turning this experience into something positive for so many others. I know I still have a long way to go, but I am committed to being part of the change.
David read John's message with a thoughtful expression. He didn't reply but felt a certain satisfaction in realizing that John was genuinely reflecting on what had happened. With the foundation established and its impact growing, David began to feel that the pain and humiliation he had endured hadn't been in vain. He had transformed the experience into a movement for awareness and support, something that would continue helping many people in the future. John, in turn, continued on his own journey of self-discovery. He started attending courses and training on bias and social justice, remaining steadfast in his commitment. He knew the change would be a slow process, but he was willing to work to become a better police officer and a better person. And so, they both continued on their paths. David as a symbol of resilience and transformation, and John as someone seeking redemption and real change. Months had passed since the incident that had changed the lives of David Langston and John Mitchell. The foundation David had created had gained momentum and was beginning to stand out in various sectors, from awareness campaigns to educational programs and legal support for victims of discrimination. The initiative was expanding rapidly, and the foundation's impact was gaining national recognition. David remained at the forefront of the foundation, participating in meetings and lectures, often invited to events at universities and conferences. He had become a respected voice in the movement against racial discrimination, but his dedication went beyond speeches. He focused on each project with meticulous attention, ensuring that the foundation was a practical and accessible resource for all who needed it. One day, during one of his visits to the foundation, David was informed that John had requested to see him again. Although reluctant, he decided to accept the meeting. He knew that John's process of change was long, but he was curious to hear what he had to say. When John arrived, he seemed calmer and more composed. He wore simple clothes and carried a folder in his hands. Upon seeing David, he smiled timidly and extended his hand in a handshake that David accepted with a cordial nod.
Mitchell, it's good to see you. What brings you here?
John hesitated for a moment, then opened the folder and took out some papers, handing them to David.
I want to show that I'm taking my commitments seriously. I've been attending trainings and workshops on bias, discrimination, and social justice. I know this doesn't erase what I did, but I want you to know that I'm trying to become a better person.
David flipped through the papers, seeing course completion reports, John's personal notes, and even written reflections on his police work. Each document seemed loaded with sincere effort, which caught David's attention. He looked up, observing John with renewed interest.
This is a good start, Mitchell. I can see that you're really dedicating yourself. But I want to remind you that self-awareness and change are ongoing. It's not enough to just attend courses and read about these issues. You need to apply this in your daily life.
I understand, sir. And that's exactly why I'm here. I'd like to ask if I can participate in some of the Foundation's activities, if you'll allow it. I believe that by engaging with and learning from the people who are part of this project, I can gain a deeper understanding.
David considered the request cautiously. He knew that allowing John to participate could be a learning experience, but there was also the risk of discomfort for others involved.
Mitchell, if you really want to be part of this, you need to be prepared to listen and truly learn, not to justify your past actions. Every person who comes here brings a story, a pain. If you agree to respect that, we can find a way to include you.
John nodded, his expression one of respect and gratitude.
I'm willing. I want to listen, learn, and help however I can.
David agreed with a slight nod and made a note to integrate John into some of the Foundation's community activities. He knew it would be a long and challenging journey for both of them, but he believed in the transformative power of coexistence and mutual respect. In the following weeks, John began participating in events organized by the Foundation. He attended lectures, joined discussion groups, and slowly began to interact with people sharing their stories and experiences. It was difficult to hear so many accounts of discrimination and bias, but he knew this was a fundamental part of his process of change. At one of these events, a young man approached him with a curious and somewhat skeptical look.
You're the officer who arrested Mr. Langston, aren't you?
John swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the question, but instead of deflecting or justifying his actions, he simply nodded.
Yes, I am. And I'm here because I want to change. I want to learn and understand how I can make a difference.
The young man observed him in silence for a moment, then gave a brief nod, as if assessing the sincerity in his words.
Well, then I hope you really do. Because we're tired of seeing things like this happen.
The brief but intense conversation left John with a new perspective on the impact of his actions. He knew he'd need to continually prove his change, and that conversation was just one of many challenges he would face. Meanwhile, David's foundation continued to grow and receive support from various organizations and public figures. Projects like the creation of a legal support center for discrimination victims and the implementation of educational programs in schools began to develop successfully. For David, seeing the foundation's transformation was a sign that his fight was not in vain. He knew the road was long, but each small victory represented progress for society and future generations. Time passed, and gradually, the relationship between John and the foundation began to solidify. He continued participating in activities, and the interactions with people there forced him to confront his prejudices even more. Slowly, he began to find his place, becoming a dedicated volunteer committed to raising awareness about equality and social justice. At a community event hosted by the foundation, David and John met again. This time, the atmosphere between them was calmer, almost amicable. David noticed that John had changed and that, although the process was slow, the officer was indeed committed to transformation.
Mitchell, I see you've been making an effort, and I believe that transformation is possible as long as it's sincere.
John smiled, feeling he was finally on the right path.
Thank you, Mr. Langston. I know I can never undo what I've done, but I'm learning that change is a constant effort.
David nodded, pleased with the response. For him, the impact of that meeting now went beyond a personal matter. He knew that each transformed person, each revised attitude, represented progress for society. At the end of the event, David watched John interacting with some young people and felt a glimmer of hope. He understood that the fight against prejudice was continuous, but seeing John committed to learning was a sign that the cycle of change, although slow, was possible. For David, the foundation was the physical representation of his commitment to justice. And for John, each day at the foundation was a chance to prove he was willing to confront his own prejudices and contribute to a better future. They both knew that their journeys were endless, but in that moment, they were willing to walk side by side, each facing their own battles while contributing to the building of a fairer and more equal society. This time, a transformation happened, but how many times does racism go unpunished? Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single story.